Hey folks, I'm Jack Fossett, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about how to get some great tones out of this guitar, the Squier Classic Vibe Stratocaster. We're going to jump right in a second here. Please remember to like and subscribe, and if you enjoy my channel, follow the links below where you can hear some music, including some of the pieces that I play in my demo videos. Let's get started. Hope you enjoy. Alright, so there's two things I want to talk about to get started here. First of all, I do want to let you know that while we're talking about how to get great tones out of this guitar, a lot of these tips are going to apply really to any Stratocaster, including especially the Squier Classic Vibe 60 Stratocaster, which those of you who know the difference, the Squier Classic Vibe 60s, it's going to have a rosewood fingerboard, and there'll be some other small, differences and things. If you play a Squier Classic Vibe 50s guitar back to back with the 60s, you might hear some little differences, but for all intents and purposes, otherwise you're just going to hear great Strat tones, and that's about it. Now, that being said, it also really applies to a lot of other Stratocasters, so hopefully this gives you some tips. If you get a Player series, if you get a Vintera series, if you have an American series Stratocaster, or whatever, there's billions of Stratocasters out there. There's not billions of Stratocasters, you understand. There's a lot of Stratocasters out there, especially ones that are 3 pickup. A lot of these tips are going to apply to that. The second thing that I want to mention is that to kind of really hit the point home, I'm not going to use a super high-end amplifier. I'm going to use, it's a great amp, but it's a much more budget-friendly amp, which is this one next to me. It's the new Fender Mustang GTX100. This is a digital modeling amp. Now, digital modeling amps are way better than they once were, but I wanted to show you how to get these tones on something a little more budget-friendly, because when push comes to shove, if you can plug a really inexpensive guitar into a great amp and get a great sound. Conversely, you can put a guitar that costs $10,000, and if you plug it into a lousy amp, it's going to sound lousy. So, the amplifier makes a little bit more of a dramatic difference to the quality of your tone than the guitar does. Ideally, you want a nice one of each, but I wanted to show you that these tips work in a very budget-friendly setup. So let's get started talking about the tones of this guitar. Now, the first thing to do, really, when you get a guitar like this, for those of you that don't know, because this guitar, being very budget-friendly, is going to be accessible to a lot of players from beginners on up. It's certainly good enough to perform and record with. It's a great guitar, but for those of you who are more in the beginner realm, you might not know all these things. So this is your pickup selector switch. You have 5 selections. You have your neck pickup, a blend of the neck and middle. You have your middle pickup. You have a blend of the middle and bridge, and then you have your bridge pickup. Essentially speaking, they go from bassier to more treble. The 5, 3, and the 1 setting, the neck, middle, and the bridge setting on their own can sound a little bit more vintage. Part of the reason for that is because the original Stratocasters did not have a 5-way switch. That came about more in the 1970s. The in-between sounds, which you will commonly hear referred to as out of phase, they're not actually out of phase, but you will hear them referred to as that. The tones in the middle that have kind of a very, very quacky sort of sound, a little bit saggier, a little bit bouncier, a little bit pluckier. The neck, middle, and bridge on their own are a little bit brasher, a little bit more bell-like, and have a little bit of a sharper attack to them. So I'm going to play a clip here, and I'm going to play clean from one pickup setting to the next so that you can kind of hear what they sound like, because they each dynamically are very, very different. The neck pickup is a very bluesy, percussive, it has some nice bass, but it has a nice attack to it so it doesn't really get muddy. You get to the neck middle, and this is just about one of the most beautiful tones on an electric guitar that you will ever hear. So much so that I recorded an entire song clean just on this pickup setting, which you can listen to right here. When you switch to the middle, this gets a really cool bluesy percussive sound. It has a little bit more biting than the neck pickup on its own. This is a very, very common early rock and roll sound, and also getting into blues and stuff. The bridge middle is very quacky and plucky. Think like if you're going to sing a song about how much you love your home in the South. Think of one of the greatest guitar players ever, Mr. Mark Knopfler. Great Mark Knopfler sounds from this position. Switch up to the bridge and it's much, much more biting and aggressive, and that very, very similar to a Telecaster as well. Great for country tones. Not that you can't play any of those things on any of these settings, but let's take a listen here. We're going to go through the clean sounds on all the pickup settings. Just going to kind of jam a little bit and change the style a little as I go from one pickup to the next, so you can kind of hear how it dynamically can suit different styles. Let's jump in. All right, now we're going to add a little overdrive. A lot of players are going to want to play with various degrees of overdrive. For the most part, right now, at least, I'm going to keep the overdrive pretty light. For this next tone, I mentioned that the bridge middle is really, really beautiful tone. Well, here's one of the other ways you can start to make your guitar more dynamic. When you listen at the beginning, I was playing with the volume wide open. It means all the way up. If you roll the volume off a bit, you're not just turning the volume down, you're actually changing the dynamic responsiveness of the guitar, including cutting some of the gain. Essentially, because the gain, the drive, is actually coming from your guitar signal pushing an amplifier. Well, if you back off the signal, you're pushing the amp less hard, which means it's going to have less grit. So you can get these really, really great, more subtle overdriven tones if you start using your volume knob a little bit. So for this tone, I'm going to put it on the neck middle setting. I'm going to back the volume off to about 7. And I'm going to play a little bit with my fingers and the pick, and this is kind of a tone sort of inspired by John Mayer. I'm not going to say this is a John Mayer tone or this is how to get a John Mayer tone, but it's kind of in that realm. It's very, very expressive. It has a really nice, you can lay into it a little bit more and you can get more grit out of it, but you can also back off and it sounds very, very clean. Great for that kind of style of playing. Check out this tone. Now, as you can tell, I'm kind of going by some of the classic artists here. I already mentioned Mark Knopfler, and you heard me play a little bit in the style of Mark Knopfler. Mentioned John Mayer, very, very famous for playing a Stratocaster, even though he plays a guitar now that is completely different than a Stratocaster. One of the guitar players who reinvented the Strat, or maybe not reinvented, but reinvigorated the Stratocaster in the 1970s was Eric Clapton when he started playing Stratocasters. What's really cool about Clapton is he's played Stratocasters for the majority of his career as his primary guitar, but because he's played for so many decades, his sound has changed all within this one guitar. So for this next tone, I'm going to get a really Clapton-inspired tone, and I'm going to do it 3 different ways. I'm going to start on the bridge middle, and I'm going to turn the volume down much further, down to about 3.5, 4-ish. The amp is on a Fender style amplifier model, and it's overdriven. And I'm going to back it way, way off, so you'll hear it has a tiny bit of grit and compression, but it's very, very clean. And on this setting, it's what Clapton has described actually as kind of like a banjo-like tone. It's got that really pluckiness, that plucky quackiness, that kind of there's a twang to it, but it's different than a Telecaster twang. Very classic Americana blues sound. This is a sound very reminiscent of what Clapton would have played in the 1970s. And then I'm going to switch back to the neck pickup, just the neck pickup on its own, turn the volume all the way up, and I've got the tone on this one rolled way, way back to like 2 or 3. Clapton was also famous for something called the woman tone. Now, originally, he got this tone using Gibson guitars with Cream. Actually, he started with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, and anyway, he would have gotten this more from a Gibson sound earlier in the days with playing a Gibson into a Marshall. Nowadays, he gets that sound using a Stratocaster into a twin Tweed amp. And if you go onto the neck pickup, you roll the tone back, and you have the volume wide open with the overdriven sound, this is a great, more modern Clapton kind of aggressive blues sound. If you've listened to any of Clapton's live stuff from the past 20 plus years, this is a tone that really gets that. Now, I'm going to switch all the way up to the bridge and roll the volume back to about like 7-ish again. And this, by again turning the volume down you're limiting your signal that's going in, which can also make it sound a little bit thinner. It's not just the volume going up and down, the whole dynamics change. This almost gets kind of like a sound he was using back in the Derek and the Dominoes days when he recorded Layla. Not exact, but again, we're not going for exact tones here. I'm just showing you how you can use the guitar and use the controls on your guitar to get a lot of different tones inspired by classic artists, or just great tones that you might not have tried to get anyway. So let's dive in here. Let's listen to some Clapton tones. Here they are. All right, next, one of the really unique pickup settings. We've talked about the two out of phase that are not out of phase tones in the number 2 and number 4 position. The middle pickup is really the one that gives this guitar all this unique variability. Now, before this guitar, there were fewer guitars that had 3 pickups. This was not by any means the original 3 pickup guitar, the Stratocaster, but it was one of the early, very, very common production model guitars that had 3 pickups. And the out of phase thing happened by accident, actually. In the old 3-way switches, you could even kind of wedge it in the middle and get the sound, which is how they discovered it. And players liked it, and they would do that on purpose, which was why they put in the 5-way switch later on. Now, this is reverse wind, reverse polarity, and what that means is that these two positions, the blended positions, are going to be hum canceling. So if you're going to a gig and you're getting a lot of this sound from your guitar, try switching to the 2 or 4 position, because that's going to cancel that hum. It's called 60 cycle hum. You get it from single coil pickups. It's not really a lot you can do about it depending on the club that you're in. There are noiseless pickups you can get, there are pedals you can get that kill your noise and everything. For the most part, single coil players just kind of deal with it and just turn your volume off between songs once the song's kicking in and everything, unless there's some serious grounding issues. Most people aren't going to kind of notice when the song's really rip-roaring. But if you really need to cancel the hum, go to that 2 or 4 position. Now we're going to talk about this middle pickup, because you can get some really cool tones from this middle pickup. Having this pickup in the middle gets you a very unique tone, different than like a Telecaster, or, if you're looking at a Gibson, a Les Paul or an SG or a 335, any of these 2 pickup guitars, which give you a blend between the bridge and the neck pickup, but they don't have a pickup of their own in the middle. This has a very, very unique kind of tone. Now, if you want to know why pickups sound different where they are, you can kind of listen. So, all right, if you strum the guitar at different places, so like let's strum here by the neck. Now we'll strum by the middle. A little bit of a difference. Now we'll strum by the bridge. So you can probably hear the most dramatic difference by the bridge. It's a little bit harder to pick up. I'm going to over-exaggerate it here. Listen to this. Much more bassy. Much more trebly. That's essentially the whole point of having pickups at different places, is it kind of picks up the way the string is vibrating. It's physics. Look it up. Anyway, this pickup gets a really, really unique tone, and this is my go-to pickup, like if I'm going for a Texas blues tone or even a Hendrix tone. So for the next 2 sounds, I'm going to use this pickup. When I say Texas blues tone, regarding a Stratocaster, you're really talking mostly about Stevie Ray Vaughan, who's one of the just all-time great Stratocaster players. Now, he, of course, used all the pickup settings. In fact, all these guys used all the pickup settings, but you can really sort of nail certain sounds that are very unique tones if you kind of know which pickup setting kind of encapsulates it the best. So I like the middle pickup setting for a Stevie Ray Vaughan tone. So for this, I'm going into another Fender model amp with a model of a tube screamer, and just going to play some kind of licks that are Stevie Ray Vaughan inspired on this middle pickup setting. Then after that, I'm going to go to a different tone with fuzz for a tone inspired by Jimi Hendrix. Same pickup setting. So let's dive in. Let's hear two different tones on the same pickup setting, just kind of using a different pedal inspiration and how it can kind of get those two similar but different but awesome and classic tones. Check this out. Now that bridge pickup that we talked about can get a really twangy country tone. It can get that kind of cool classic rock tone. This can also get really, really aggressive and have a incredibly powerful screaming tone if you use it into the right sound. So here's the other thing about this. The character of the sound has arguably as much, if not more, to do with the amp and effects that you're using. You know, if I plug this guitar into a Princeton reverb with no pedals and I play on the bridge pickup, it's going to be a completely different sound than if I plug into a Marshall stack with a fuzz pedal. And you can't play them the same way. You can't play the same licks. I mean, you can, but you have to do them dynamically different in order to make it work musically. So just remember that. When you're talking about tone tips for a guitar, a lot of times it has to do with tone tips for the amplifier as well. So for this sound, I'm going to go for one of the other great Stratocaster players of all time, Mr. David Gilmour. Going to use a tone that's built into this amp. That's one of the presets. It's a Gilmour inspired tone. This is a British style amplifier with a fuzz pedal with some delay, going for a really, really classic screaming, shrieking lead tone that you can get just by cranking everything up, pushing it forward, and letting it rip. Check this out. Now, on that note, one of the cool things about the Stratocaster is because of its dynamic range. Bass is very bassy, the high is very trebly. It has a huge dynamic range as a guitar, but retains a very, very sharp attack of the note, an attack character. So like it's got a lot of bass in this guitar, but it doesn't sound muddy if you're on the neck pickup. It's got a lot of treble in this position, but it still kind of retains this sort of like throaty growl to the way that you play. That makes this guitar ideal for use with effects. Some guitars don't work well with effects because of the way that they pick up the sound and everything. They could be too muddy or they could be too thin. Stratocaster is one of the best guitars ever made for use with effects. For this last tone, I'm just going to play clean with a Univibe. It's one of the most beautiful sounds. I love this sound. Very, very 60s and 70s inspired. Playing it on that same pickup setting, the neck middle. Check out this really nice clean tone. All right, folks, to close out, I want to say one last kind of tone tip regarding everything that we've talked about is if you just back off your volume and tone a little bit, that can make a huge, huge difference to your sound. So like, let's say that you've got this guitar, if you are a beginner, or if you're an intermediate player and you're going from practicing at home or just practicing jamming with some players to getting into a live music setting where you're playing in front of people and you're playing louder, you may find that all of a sudden the tones that you had at home that you were practicing with don't sound as good. They might sound, it's because when you turn the volume up, it's kind of like the volume knob on the guitar. When you turn things up, it doesn't just get louder or get softer. It kind of blooms. That's one of the cool things about the electric guitar, but it's also something you need to understand in order to know how to deal with. If you turn the volume up on your amplifier, the treble gets more trebly, the bass gets bassier, the mid-range gets fatter and punchier. Well, sometimes that treble can get really nasty. Well, you can, if you back off your volume knob to like 9, and then you back your tone knob off to between like 7 and 9, you can just kind of pull some of that tone that's all of a sudden a little too harsh and almost make it feel more like it did at that lower volume level. Make sure that you play with your volume and tone knobs. They are there for a reason, and there are a lot of tones locked in these 4 things, in your volume, your 2 tones, and your pickup selector switch. Out of those 4 controls, you have a whole world of possibilities, and this guitar captures that very well. Folks, thank you for tuning in. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.